Jim, and hello, VERGE Net Zero. Let's dive right in. President Biden's federal sustainability plan outlines an ambitious path to achieve net zero emissions by 2050 through federal procurement, including increasing the sustainability and resilience of federal supply chains. Now, central to this plan are the goals of powering the government's 300,000 buildings with 100% carbon-free energy by 2030, electrifying its fleet of 600,000 cars and trucks by 2035, and ratcheting down the carbon footprint of the $630 billion that the government spends each year on its products and services. Now, this last item is what we will be focusing on today, and I am delighted to be joined by the White House's Chief Sustainability Officer, Andrew Mayock, for this conversation. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you, Shana. It's great to be here.
So, Andrew, the U.S. government is the world's largest buyer of goods and services. And with last month's announcement of the proposed federal supplier climate risk and resilience rule, it will soon be the first national government to actually require that major suppliers disclose their greenhouse gas emissions, climate-related financial risks, and set emission reduction goals that are aligned with the Paris Agreement. This is a big deal and has the potential to be very significant. I'd love for you to talk a little bit about what the proposed rule actually means for businesses and who specifically it will impact.
Thank you, Shana. It's great to be here today to talk about this important action. As the world's largest buyer, our federal government faces significant financial risks from climate change. And as you know, and as the audience knows, we've seen supply chain disruption over the last few years, through and through. Vehicles, electricity, power, we're in this big energy crisis right now. So it's well aware to the federal government and to other major buyers and to the American public in general how important supply chain is. So we're taking this action today in order to do that, to make us more resilient, to make us more stronger as we move forward in the climate challenge ahead. And so I want to say a couple words about how we designed the rule and how we're executing on it. And so number one, a really important part, as you said, is that it's focused on our major suppliers. So it's going to affect primarily 80% of our spend and 80% of the GHG and our supply chain. And so the first part of the rule that's important to know is that it covers those for which we spend $50 million a year or more on this $650 billion overall spend that the federal government has every year. And so for whom we buy $50 million or more annually, we're going to require them to do three things. Number one, tell us their GHG emissions. Number two, tell us about their climate risks. And number three, set science-based targets. And so that's the major supplier requirement. And then we go to a second tier. And on that second tier, those are suppliers from which we spend between $7.5 million annually and $50 million annually. So they're small and medium sized, basically. And what we're asking of them is to disclose their scope 1 and 2 emissions. So we want GHG emissions for them, scope 1 and 2, and that's their whole requirement. And then there's another set of suppliers, and that's the 7.5 million and below. And so they're exempt from the rule. We're not asking them to participate in the rule. And through that overall approach, we've covered 95% of our spend and 95% of our GHG emissions.
Today, if I understand this correctly, more than half of major federal contractors are actually already disclosing climate-related information through CDP. I think 25% or so have actually committed to science-based targets. How, not kind of middle and lower category that you named, how does the rule potentially impact smaller to mid-sized companies that aren't yet reporting, but are being invited to do so?
Yeah, you've done some excellent homework there, Shana. And that's entirely true about the profile of our supplier base. And, one of the tenets of the Biden administration, one of the critical pieces of this is we want to make sure to the risk-based targeted approach that when it comes to our medium and small size businesses, that we ask what's important of them. And so that's why we made that critical decision to move to the disclosure for them, but not add the additional requirement of the climate risk and additional requirement of science-based targets. So we're making sure that when it comes to regulation, small and medium-sized businesses are a part of the policy and an important part of our pathway forward, but the work that they need to do is tailored to their size of business and the work that they do.
So, Andrew, I want to talk a little bit about enforcement because this rule clearly sends a very, very powerful signal. And to date, companies have been disclosing and setting targets mostly voluntarily. And so I'm curious to hear a little bit from your perspective, what role, if any, should the federal government be playing in ensuring that these targets are actually being set, are actually being hit?
Yeah, that's a critical question, and it goes to the design and the implementation of the rule too. As you noted, 50% of our major suppliers take care of that first step that we're talking about already, the disclosure per CDP. And what this rule is doing for those major suppliers is, raising the floor. It's bringing in that other 50%. And what it's doing, what it's saying to them is in order to work with us, to be a partner with the federal government, you need to not only do the GHG disclosure, but the climate disclosure risk, as I mentioned, and also the science-based targets. And what we're seeking to incent and deliver through that is to move to a place where we have comparable measurement across our supplier base soonest. And then through the management theory and practice as to what gets measured gets done. So we're going to have an ability here as this very large consumer to set an example for others, as a number of leading American private sector companies have done with their supply chain, and therefore accelerate this movement and this effort overall. So we're going to take this first step. We're going to get our major suppliers in compliance with these three core requirements, and then we're going to keep moving and developing the work as we move forward.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you, Andrew. So as we come into our final minute or so together, I want to talk a little bit about what happens from here. The rule is now open for a 60-day comment period through January 13th. What kind of engagement would you like to see from the private sector? And beyond that, what does really meaningful partnership with the business community look like over the longer term?
Great. Yeah, a couple things on that, Shana. Number one, by design, the rule is put out for comment because we want to hear from you. We want to hear from the general public. We want to hear from climate change advocates. We want to hear from our critics. We want to hear from, of course, our major suppliers. So we'd really like to get input during this period that's designed for input, number one. Number two is, per the whole effort that VERGE is hosting here, we asked this group to join us. Big piece of President Biden's climate change agenda is public-private partnership. And I'd say a quick couple things about that. Number one is, we've had the opportunity of the last couple of years to learn from, as a federal government, as we got back into the game and got back into frontline leadership on climate from a number of major leading American companies and how they're delivering in really aggressive and proactive and constructive ways on the climate challenge. So when it comes to our procurement for carbon-free electricity, when it comes to electrifying our fleet, as you noted, of 640,000 vehicles, we've done a lot of learning from the outside. Now we're doing a lot of partnering with the outside. And so we have an outstretched hand to join other leaders in delivering on our current commitments and expanding those commitments. So I welcome others to join us today if you're not quite there yet. And we look forward to continuing to work with those we're working with now. And I really appreciate the opportunity today to join VERGE and to speak with you, Shana. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Andrew, for joining us for this conversation, for speaking to this really exciting announcement. We share your enthusiasm about all that lies ahead. We really appreciate the leadership that you and the administration are bringing to the issue. Thank you so much.
Thank you.